The letter from the county planning department arrived on a Tuesday, and I want to tell you right now that its arrival was not the most surprising thing that happened that week. The most surprising thing was what I found when I called the contact number listed at the bottom of the letter to ask what specifically about a 12 by 14-foot wooden treehouse built in a backyard oak tree constituted a non-permitted residential structure requiring immediate removal or compliance review. The woman who picked up, a permit technician named Carol Esteves, who had the particular world-weary patience of someone who processes a lot of complaints she personally finds puzzling, confirmed that the complaint had been filed not by the county independently, but by a private citizen through the county's online complaint portal, that the citizen had described the structure as a multi-level unauthorized residential annex with potential electrical and structural safety hazards, and that the county was required by its own ordinance to investigate any complaint about an unpermitted structure regardless of the apparent scale of the structure in question. Multi-level residential annex, I said. That's the language in the complaint, Carol said, in a tone that told me she'd read it too. It's a treehouse. Yes, she said, I gathered that from the photos. There are photos. The complainant submitted 6. They appear to have been taken from the neighboring property. I thanked Carol and hung up, and stood in my kitchen for a moment thinking about the woman who had climbed a ladder or a step stool or whatever one climbs to photograph a neighbor's child's treehouse from the other side of a fence, and submitted those photographs to the county planning department under the description multi-level residential annex with potential electrical and structural safety hazards. And I felt something I've only recently learned to correctly identify, which is not anger exactly, but the particular focused clarity that arrives when a situation reveals itself to be simpler than it first appeared, because the person on the other side of it has told you, accidentally, exactly what they're willing to do. Her name was Harriet Colton. She lived behind us, our backyard separated by a 6-foot cedar privacy fence I'd installed 2 years earlier, and she had been a background presence in our lives since we moved into Sycamore Ridge about 4 years before this story begins. The kind of neighbor who was visible enough that you always knew she was there and present enough that you couldn't forget her, but who had, until the treehouse, remained on the sustainable end of difficult. She'd filed one HOA complaint about our compost bin being olfactorily impactful in year 2, which was dismissed by our HOA property manager, a patient man named Franklin D., after he came out and determined the bin was appropriately sealed and positioned well within our property. She had sent a letter to the entire street's residents suggesting we coordinate on holiday decorations to maintain what she called visual coherence, which I'm fairly sure nobody responded to. And she had twice knocked on our door to inquire whether our dog's nighttime barking could be addressed, which it could and was, and which I mention because I want to be fair. 2 of the 3 things Harriet had done before the treehouse were at least borderline reasonable. The treehouse was not reasonable territory to enter. The treehouse was my husband Owen's project, and I want to tell you about it in some detail because understanding what it actually was matters for understanding what it became. Owen is an environmental scientist who works for a university extension program studying urban tree canopy health and soil-moisture relationships in residential neighborhoods, which is a more interesting job than it sounds. And when he decided to build a treehouse for our 2 kids, 9-year-old Lena and 7-year-old Marcus, he approached it the way he approaches everything, which is to say with more research than most people bring to decisions that are 3 times as consequential. He spent 4 months designing it. He consulted a certified arborist about the load capacity and health of the white oak it would sit in, a 70-year-old tree with a trunk diameter of nearly 2 feet and a crown spread that shaded most of our backyard. He built the platform supports using a technique called perch mounting, which doesn't drive bolts into the tree, but distributes the load across brackets that sit against the bark rather than through it, specifically to minimize tree stress. The structure itself was 12 by 14 feet of the main platform, with a smaller 8 by 8 observation deck extending from the east side that gave you a view over the privacy fence line into the broader neighborhood canopy. The whole build took Owen and our neighbor from down the street, a retired contractor named Vic Okafor who'd offered to help because he said he wanted a project 11 weekends from early March to late May. Lena and Marcus helped as much as kids that age can, which is mostly handing things and asking questions, and occasionally doing something genuinely useful. And by the time it was finished in late May, it was the most beautifully built piece of backyard infrastructure I had ever seen in a residential yard, with proper railing heights, an enclosed ladder with hand rungs, a weather-resistant deck surface, and because Owen is the person he is. A small mounted instrument panel on the observation deck that included a digital thermometer, a small rain gauge, and a weather vane he'd picked up from a science education supplier that the kids had put together themselves on a Saturday afternoon. The instrument panel was, as it turned out, going to matter considerably more than any of us expected when the county complaint arrived 4 months after the build was finished. Owen had introduced the kids to the instruments carefully, the way he introduces anything scientific to them, starting with what the instrument measured, then why that measurement mattered, then how to read and record it. Lena, who was 9 and had recently decided she wanted to be a scientist or a veterinarian or possibly both, had absorbed this with the focused attention she brought to things she decided were important. Marcus, who was 7 and whose attention moved faster than his sister's, had grasped the basics and then gotten distracted by the view, which was also fine. Owen had given them a small data log notebook for recording the instrument readings whenever they went up, and by the time Harriet Colton filed her county complaint, that notebook had 4 months of entries in it, written in Lena's careful handwriting with occasional contributions from Marcus in a different pen. Harriet had watched the treehouse being built over those 11 weekends from whatever vantage point she had behind or above her side of the fence. I knew she'd been watching because Vic had mentioned it twice, with the good humor of a man who finds people interesting rather than annoying, noting that the fence top gave a clear view from Harriet's second-floor window and that there had been a presence there during most of the build weekends. I'd thought nothing of it. People watch construction in their neighborhood. It's a normal human interest. What Harriet had apparently been doing during those weekends was not just watching but building a case, because the county complaint, when I eventually obtained a full copy through the county's records request process, had been filed with a level of specificity that didn't come from a single glance out a window. She had documented the build dates, the approximate dimensions of the structure at each stage, her characterization of the construction materials, and her concern that the structure had been built without permits, without inspections, and without regard for the safety of adjacent properties, which last phrase confused me briefly since the treehouse was positioned in the center of our yard with approximately 20 feet of clearance from our fence line. Until I understood that the adjacent property she was concerned about was hers, and the safety concern was apparently the possibility that the observation deck gave my children a view over the top of the cedar fence into her backyard. I want to be precise about this. The observation deck of my children's treehouse looked out over the neighborhood canopy, which is exactly what Owen had designed it to do because he is an environmental scientist with a professional interest in urban canopy observation. The fact that it also gave you a view that included the top third of Harriet Colton's backyard, including her above-ground pool and her patio furniture, was incidental, and I want to be very clear about this. I have never, in 4 years of living behind Harriet, had any interest in looking at Harriet's backyard. Neither have my children. But apparently Harriet had spent those 11 build weekends convinced that my 9-year-old and 7-year-old had been placed in a tree specifically to surveil her outdoor activities, a conclusion I find flattering as a theory of my children's interest in surveillance operations and utterly baffling as anything else. So she'd filed the county complaint, and the county was now required to investigate, and Carol Esteves had a file with 6 photographs of my children's treehouse labeled multi-level residential annex with potential electrical and structural safety hazards. And here's where things started to get interesting. I called Owen at his office and told him about the complaint. He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a scientist receiving new data, and then he said, "Does it mention the instrument panel?" "The weather instruments." "Yes." "No, why?" He was quiet again, and then he said something that I initially thought was a joke and then realized was not. Nadia, that instrument panel is part of my research. I've been using the kids' treehouse as a microclimate observation point for the urban canopy study I've been running. I've got 8 months of temperature, precipitation, and humidity data from that deck. It's a legitimate field observation site. I stared at the letter in my hand for a moment. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying, Owen said, in the careful way he has when he's working something out while he's talking, that a structure housing active scientific instruments and being used as a data collection point for a university-affiliated research program might have a different regulatory classification than a standard residential backyard structure. And if it does, the complaint about it being an unpermitted residential structure might not have a particularly clean path forward. I told him to call his department head and find out exactly what that classification would look like. He called me back in 40 minutes. What Owen had found, after a 40-minute conversation with his department head, a man named Dr. Fergus Malone, who had spent 30 years navigating the specific intersection of academic research, public land use, and residential property regulations, and who apparently found this situation genuinely interesting, was that the university's extension program had a category for what it called distributed field observation sites, which were locations not owned by the university, where researchers had installed or were maintaining scientific monitoring equipment as part of an approved study, and where those locations were registered with the program's Research Compliance Office. The designation was primarily used for things like stream gauge stations maintained in partnership with private landowners, or air quality sensors placed on private rooftops with owner permission, but the governing framework didn't restrict it to those specific applications. It applied to any site where university-approved research equipment was installed and data was being actively collected. The instrument panel on Owen's Treehouse observation deck was university-affiliated research equipment. The data from it was actively being collected. The site was private property where the equipment had been installed with the property owner's knowledge and permission, which was easy to document since Owen was the property owner. The research was part of an approved study registered with the university's Institutional Review Board. Dr. Malone said, according to Owen, something along the lines of, "This is the most interesting compliance question I've gotten in at least 5 years. Let me make some calls." The calls Dr. Malone made over the following 2 weeks resulted in the formal registration of our backyard treehouse as distributed field, Site DF47, in the university's urban canopy microclimate study, with an official registration document, a site identification number, a university extension program letterhead confirmation of the site's research status, and a notation in the study's methodology section describing the site's contribution to the program's longitudinal temperature and precipitation dataset. Our treehouse had become a certified research station. Franklin D., our HOA property manager, called me the same week the registration came through because the HOA had also received the county's investigation notice and because apparently one of the board members had asked him to find out what was going on with the treehouse situation. I told him the full story, including the university designation. There was a silence on the line that lasted several seconds. "So it's a research station," Franklin said. "Distributed field site DF47, I said. Urban canopy microclimate study, 8 months of longitudinal data." Another silence. "Harriet filed the county complaint," he said. "It wasn't a question." 6 photographs, I said, including what she described as the electrical components, which are a digital thermometer, a rain gauge, and a weather vane. Franklin made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the general neighborhood of one. "I'm going to need a copy of the university registration document," he said, "for the file." I sent it to him that afternoon. I also sent a copy to Carol Esteves at the County Planning Department, along with a brief cover letter from Dr. Malone's office on university letterhead, explaining the site's research designation and noting that the structure was currently functioning as an active scientific field observation point for an ongoing university study. Carol called me back 2 days after receiving the documentation. She said, consulted with the county's planning division about the regulatory status of a structure that housed active scientific monitoring equipment registered to a university research program. The answer, as she explained it, was that such a structure fell into a specific category distinct from standard residential construction. It was an accessory structure associated with an educational and research use, which the county's own code treated differently from unpermitted residential construction, and which was not, under the specific circumstances described by the university's registration documentation, subject to the same removal or compliance review process that applied to unpermitted habitable residential structures. So it doesn't need to come down, I said. That's correct, Carol said. She paused. I'm going to close the complaint as unfounded. I wrote that down in my notes, underlined it, and sat with it for a moment. Can I ask, I said, what category the county uses for this kind of structure? Carol looked something up. Temporary non-habitable accessory structure associated with educational and scientific research use, she said. It's actually pretty rare. Most complaints about these we've seen involve weather monitoring equipment on rooftops. Has anyone tried it with a treehouse before? There was a pause. Not that I can find in our records, she said, and I could hear in her voice the faint but unmistakable sound of someone suppressing a laugh while maintaining professional composure, which was, under the circumstances, the most satisfying thing I had heard all month. I called Owen and told him. He came home early. We stood in the backyard looking at the treehouse, and the kids didn't know any of this was happening and were up on the main platform playing some elaborate game involving a cardboard city they'd been building for a week. The instrument panel was visible from below, the little weather vane rotating slowly in the late afternoon breeze. Lena called down, Dad, the temperature up here is 4.2 degrees warmer than at ground level. I wrote it in the log. Owen had given them a data log the month before, a small notebook for recording the instrument readings whenever they were up there. He told them they were helping with his research, which was true. Lena had taken this with the complete, focused seriousness of a 9-year-old who has been told she's a scientist. Owen looked at me. She's not wrong, he said. The temperature differential in the canopy zone is actually part of what we're studying. I looked at the research station that used to be just a treehouse. I know, I said, and now the county knows too. What happened next, involving Harriet Colton, the HOA board, a second attempt at removal, and the extraordinary meeting where Dr. Malone attended in person, is where this story gets even better. When we left off, the county complaint had been closed as unfounded. The treehouse had been officially registered as distributed field, Site DF47 of the university's urban canopy microclimate study, and Lena had added another temperature reading to the data log. Here's what happened next, and why the story didn't end with the county closing the complaint, because Harriet Colton was not finished. Harriet filed a second complaint 11 days after receiving written notification from the county that the first complaint had been closed as unfounded. This time she didn't file with the county planning department. She filed directly with the Sycamore Ridge HOA board in a formal written complaint that was 7 paragraphs long and that I obtained a full copy of through the HOA's standard records disclosure process. The complaint argued that regardless of whatever designation the county had applied to the structure, the Sycamore Ridge HOA's own governing documents required that any structure in a residential backyard that exceeded certain height and footprint thresholds had to receive specific board approval before construction, that our treehouse had not received this approval, and that the board was therefore obligated to require either retroactive approval or removal. She was, on the technical question of whether we'd received prior board approval, correct. We had not sought board approval before building the treehouse because we'd looked at the HOA's governing documents before starting construction and had determined, based on the language about accessory structures, that a non-habitable backyard structure of the treehouse's scale didn't require prior approval under the existing rules. I'd confirmed this reading with Franklin, who had agreed with my interpretation at the time, but the governing documents weren't completely unambiguous on the question, and Harriet had found the ambiguous section and built her second complaint around it. Franklin called me the morning after receiving the complaint. It's more substantive than the county complaint was, he said carefully. She found the height provision in the accessory structure section. Technically, it does say structures over 12 feet require board review. He paused. I think you know it wasn't written with treehouses in mind, but I have to process what's filed. What does board review actually mean in this context? I asked. The board looks at the structure, considers whether it complies with the spirit of the community standards, and makes a decision about whether to approve it retroactively or require modification. He paused again. I want to be honest with you, 3 of the 5 board members have kids or grandkids. They're not going to tear down a treehouse, but Harriet is entitled to have her complaint heard. He scheduled a board review meeting for 3 weeks later, which was the earliest the full board could gather, and sent formal notification to both us and Harriet that the matter would be considered at that meeting, with both parties having the opportunity to present. I called Owen and told him. He listened, and then he said, I want to call Dr. Malone. I asked why. Because Dr. Malone, Owen said, has been looking for an opportunity to describe the research value of the site in person to someone in an official capacity, and I think this might be more interesting for him than for anyone to fully anticipate. Dr. Fergus Malone was 71 years old, had spent 30 years in his field, had published more papers than he could quickly count if you asked him, and had, in Owen's description, the specific enthusiasm for regulatory frameworks intersecting with scientific research that tends to develop in people who have spent their careers navigating that intersection. He was also, Owen told me, genuinely invested in field site DF47 as a research point because the White Oak's age and size made it one of the more interesting microclimate observation positions in the urban canopy studies dataset, and he'd told Owen the previous month that the longitudinal data from that site was going to be meaningful. Dr. Malone said yes immediately. He also said, according to Owen, that he intended to bring a summary of the research data collected from the site to date, printed in the format the program used for academic presentations, and that he might also bring Patricia Chu, the land use attorney who'd advised on the county classification, if she was available, because he thought having legal confirmation of the structure's regulatory status available in the room would be useful. I like these meetings, Dr. Malone told Owen. People expect them to be administrative, and they turn out to be interesting. I find that appealing. He came, Patricia Chu came, I came, Owen came, Harriet came. Franklin ran the meeting, with the 5 board members in a row behind the folding table at the front of the community room, the same room where I'd attended 3 previous HOA meetings in 4 years, and which had never before had a research scientist and a land use attorney sitting in the second row. Harriet presented first as the complainant. Her argument was coherent and organized because Harriet Colton was, whatever else she was, someone who prepared thoroughly. She cited the governing document provision about structures over 12 feet. She argued that a retroactive approval process required the board to evaluate whether the structure met community standards. She presented a printed sheet with photos of the treehouse, the same type of photographs she'd submitted to the county, and argued that its visual profile from her property was an ongoing intrusion on her outdoor experience. She did not mention the county complaint, presumably because the county had ruled against her, and mentioning it would have required explaining why. She was on firm ground about the height provision and shaky ground about everything else, and she knew it, which I could tell because her presentation was longest on the section about the provision and shortest on the section about community standards impact. Then Owen presented. I want to describe this carefully because it was one of the better 20 minutes of my life. Owen is an environmental scientist, which means he spends a significant portion of his professional life explaining things to non-specialists, and he does it with the particular gift of someone who loves what he studies and communicates that love in a way that makes the subject come alive for the person listening. He started with the white oak. He described the tree's age, its health, the arborist's assessment of its canopy structure. He described the perch mounting system and why it was better for the tree than conventional bolt mounting. He showed the board members the arborist's written assessment, which Sandra Wu had agreed to provide a copy of when Owen called and explained the situation. Then he talked about the instruments. He explained what each one measured and why those measurements mattered to understanding urban heat island effects and microclimate variation at the residential level. He pulled up a graph on his laptop showing 12 months of temperature data from field site DF47, with the differential between the canopy level deck measurement and ground level measurements annotated. He explained what that differential told researchers about how tree canopy affects local temperature regulation, and why that understanding mattered for urban planning, climate resilience, and the design of future residential neighborhoods. Then he said, calmly and without drama, "I'd also like to introduce Dr. Fergus Malone, who directs the university's Urban Canopy Microclimate Study and who registered this site as part of that study, and Patricia Chu, who has advised the program on the regulatory framework for distributed field sites." Dr. Malone stood up. He was a compact, white-haired man with the kind of precise posture that comes from spending decades at lecterns, and he had in his hands a folder that he set on the table with the comfortable authority of someone who had presented research to rooms considerably larger and less friendly than this community meeting space. He described the study, its methodology, its significance, and the site's contribution to the dataset in the organized, accessible way of someone who had explained his work to hundreds of people who didn't start out understanding it and had become very good at bringing them along. He noted that field site DF47 was now part of a published dataset that had been cited in 2 preliminary papers on urban microclimate modeling, which he mentioned not because he thought the board members would know those papers, but because it established that the research was real, productive, and ongoing. Then Patricia Chu provided a 2-page written summary of the county code classification, the university's distributed field site designation framework, and her analysis of how those 2 frameworks interacted with the HOA's own accessory structure provisions. The key finding, which she explained concisely and clearly, was that a structure housing active scientific monitoring equipment registered to an approved university research program occupied a regulatory classification that overlapped with but was not identical to standard residential accessory structures, and that within the HOA's own governing documents there was a provision, in the section on permitted uses, explicitly allowing for educational and research activities conducted on residential property in partnership with educational institutions, which Harriet's complaint had not addressed because Harriet had apparently not found that section when she'd been looking for the height provision. The educational and research activities provision, which had been there in the governing documents the whole time. Franklin found it in under 40 seconds once Patricia pointed him to the relevant section. He read it, looked up, looked at Harriet, looked at the board, and said, in the particularly careful tone of a man maintaining scrupulous neutrality, "That section appears to be directly applicable here." One of the board members, a retired teacher named Grace Ose, who had a granddaughter about Lena's age, asked whether the kids actually used the site for data collection or whether that was just the classification. Owen opened the data log notebook and set it on the table. The handwriting was visibly a child's, careful and earnest, columns of dates and temperatures and precipitation readings in Lena's precise hand, with a few entries in Marcus's less consistent script toward the back. Grace Osai looked at the notebook for a long moment, then she looked at Owen. "How old is she?" 9, Owen said. "She wants to be a scientist." Grace looked at the notebook again, then she looked at the rest of the board. "I think we've heard enough," she said. The vote was 4-1 to approve the structure retroactively under the Educational and Research Partnership provision, with the one dissenting vote coming from a board member who'd arrived late and appeared to have missed most of the presentations, and was relying on what he'd gathered from the last 5 minutes, which was enough to give him the general impression of what was being decided, but not the full context of why. He voted no, with the slightly uncertain expression of a man who wasn't quite sure what he was voting no to. Nobody asked him to explain it. Harriet did not say anything when the vote was announced. She had been sitting very still through the latter part of the meeting, the part after Patricia's presentation, with the particular stillness of someone processing the realization that the regulatory framework they'd thought was going to help them has just been explained, precisely and clearly, to not do what they'd expected it to do. She gathered her printed materials, her 7-paragraph complaint, and her photographs, and walked out before Franklin had finished recording the vote in the meeting minutes. The door didn't close loudly, it just closed. Franklin had the vote recorded in 5 minutes. He looked up, found me and Owen in the second row, and gave a small professional nod of the kind that means the record is complete and the matter is closed. Dr. Malone and Patricia Chu were already talking to each other quietly about something related to the land use memo, the comfortable shorthand of two people who have collaborated before. Grace Osa had asked Owen one more question about the data log while the vote was being recorded, something about the rain gauge and how it compared to the official weather station 2 miles away. And Owen had answered her with the particular warmth he has when explaining his work to someone who's genuinely interested. I looked at the data log notebook in Owen's hand. The cover was slightly worn at one corner where Lena had carried it up and down the ladder dozens of times. The spine was still tight. The handwriting inside moved from uncertain at the beginning, the first few entries where Lena had been learning the format, to confident and consistent, the entries from the past 6 months done in the steady hand of a kid who'd done something long enough to make it routine. We went home and the kids were with Owen's mother for the evening, and we sat on the back porch looking at field site DF47 in the dark, the site placard on the railing just visible in the porch light. The weather vane wasn't moving. The data logger on the thermometer would be recording whatever the temperature was at canopy level, the way it recorded it every 15 minutes, every day. Harriet did not file another complaint. She didn't come to the next HOA meeting or the one after that, which Franklin mentioned to me quietly at the third one when she wasn't there either. I don't know whether she'd decided the situation was exhausted or had found other things to focus her attention on, or had simply done the math on the outcomes and concluded the next action available to her wasn't worth pursuing. I don't need to know. The treehouse is still there. The research is still running. The university published the first full paper from the urban canopy microclimate study 8 months after the HOA meeting, in a peer-reviewed journal that Owen had me help him read the proofs of, which took an evening and required me to ask more questions than I'd expected. Field site DF47 appears in the methodology section with the notation private residential canopy site, registered owner consent, and active participation. The data from our backyard oak contributed to a finding about temperature differentials in mature residential tree canopy zones that apparently confirmed something the modeling had predicted, but hadn't had ground truth data to verify. Lena found out about the paper when Owen showed her the published version on his laptop. She read the methodology section, moving her lips slightly on the harder words the way she does. She found the DF47 reference. She looked up. "We're in the paper," she said. "Your data is in the paper," Owen said. She looked at it again. Then she went and got the data log notebook and sat at the kitchen table with both open side by side, cross-referencing her readings against the study's dataset with the focused quiet of someone doing something important. After about 20 minutes she looked up and said, "Dad, my temperature readings match the ones in the paper." "They should," Owen said. "They're the same data." She nodded slowly, the way you nod when something you understood logically has just become something you understand in your body. Then she went back to cross-referencing, and I watched her, and I thought about Harriet Colton standing on a step stool behind her fence, taking photos of this treehouse with the intention of having it removed. And I thought about what a remarkable sequence of events had delivered us to this particular outcome instead. The data log has 43 months of entries now. Marcus has started keeping his own column. This spring, Dr. Malone visited in person for the first time, brought a graduate student who was helping with the current analysis phase, and spent an hour on the observation deck with Owen and both kids, explaining what the data was showing and what questions it opened up. Lena asked 14 questions. Marcus asked 3, which were all good ones. Sandra Wu, the arborist, came by 2 months ago for a routine tree health check and reported the white oak was thriving, the perch mounting was causing no measurable stress, and that in her professional opinion, the tree would outlast everyone in the yard. I believe her, and I think Harriet Colton, wherever she's directing her attention these days, would be very surprised by how the structure she tried to have removed has turned out. Thumbnail text, 10 words. She reported my treehouse. We turned it into a research station.